for joining us this morning for our online launch. We are still online, and I think we will continue to be online even when we return to our offices. Our online launch for our progress report to Parliament this year. This year it's a bumper edition, so we have two reports that we are publishing today covering progress in reducing emissions and also our progress on covering climate change adaptation, which we do every 2 years. So we've got a lot to cover today. We've got a great session for you this morning to take you through the findings in those reports and then a Q&A at the end. So I'm Chris Stark, I'm the CCC's Chief Executive. I'm going to be your host today. Here's what we're going to cover this morning. First, we're going to have some introductory remarks from Lord Deben, our chairman, and then on to Baroness Brown, the chair of our Adaptation Committee. And then the meat of the event this morning is our presentations from David Joffe, who's our head of carbon budgets, and Catherine Brown, our head of adaptation. After the presentations, I'm really delighted to say that we are joined by Tim Harford, the economist, the journalist and broadcaster. He's going to chair our Q&A. I'm hoping Tim will have some challenging questions for us, which hopefully you will be submitting. So we are doing this morning on Zoom in the webinar setting, which allows us to have questions as we go along. So I want to start this morning by encouraging you to submit your questions as we continue today in the early part of this session as we broadcast to you. Please think of the questions that you have for us, and then we can come back to those in the Q&A afterwards. We should have this morning plenty of time for questions. Now, I'm going to ask James to post some guidance in the chat about how we're going to handle the questions, which you can have a look at. But let's get started on the important messages that we have for you today. And let me first turn to Lord Deben, who can open up the proceedings today with his comments. Over to you, John.
Well, thank you very much. And I am very excited that we should be launching this today. Not least because it celebrates the fact that the government has made some historic promises, some historic decisions. First of all, it started, of course, with the net zero decision. Then that we were going to meet that by reducing our emissions by 68% by the year 2030, which was a nationally determined contribution, which really set the ball rolling for COP26. And then to confirm that with a new date, a new amount for 2035. And of course, here the government's acceptance of the 6th carbon budget, which is a real blueprint, a route map really, for how we get to net zero in 2050. So there is much to celebrate. The problem is that there is very little action, very little delivery to show that what we have promised we are going to achieve. And that for us is the crucial issue in this report. We have gone department by department. So it's not just an overall government statement. It's about what each department is doing. And the problem is that in almost every area, there have been serious delays. And where there hasn't been delay, the ambition has not been realized in the action. We haven't hit the mark. We haven't actually put forward policies which will reach the necessary level of emission reduction. Now, it's absolutely true. We can look back and see that over the last 30 years, we've done remarkable things in reduction of our emissions, but almost entirely for the reduction has come from generation. It's the power system, and very little elsewhere. And it's that elsewhere which is now the really serious area of action. So we're making it very clear in this report that, first of all, we have got to have a net zero policy which is absolutely based upon action and delivery. Now, we've been promised it. It hasn't come yet, but we have got to have it well before the COP26, because if it isn't there, the government's promises will not be taken seriously, and the outcomes of COP26 will be very, very seriously compromised. And secondly, we must look at everything that we do in light of net zero. We must have a net zero test. So in the forthcoming planning bill, it would be quite impossible to have a new sense of sensible planning unless at the heart of it is that every planning decision must ask the question, does this contribute to our commitment to net zero? And that's true right the way through the government. I have had to say that there's a huge amount still to be done in the immediate future by MHCLG and by one of our so-called sponsoring departments, DEFRA, and even BEIS, which has done very well in many ways. There are still delays and things that we really have got to have if we're going to face the future with the assurance that we will not only promise, but that we will deliver. And we can't do that unless we also recognize that we have to come to terms with the adaptation which is necessary, because climate change is happening. This is not something we do just for our children or our grandchildren. It's something we do for us, however old we are. And we are not ready. We have not made the adaptation changes that we need to make. And many of them are absolutely necessary to reach net zero. So when we say we're committed to net zero, we really do have to have those adaptation elements absolutely central so that we are a resilient economy. So it's on that I want to turn to Baroness Brown in order to emphasize how far behind we are, not just on changing and moving and acting and delivering on mitigation, but on the whole question of adaptation.
Thank you very much, Lord Deben. And as Lord Deben says, our headline message is, of course, that the rate at which we are adapting to the coming changes that the climate will bring is just not keeping up with the rate of future change. So across most sectors of our lives and the economy, we're not prepared for even the 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming that we will get on a net zero path, let alone the more extreme climate change we will get if the global commitments and the global delivery doesn't get us on to that path. And sadly, unlike mitigation, where we have seen high ambition and we are concerned about delivery, in adaptation, we haven't yet seen that high ambition. Indeed, it's very much a story of doing too little, too late so far. So the government recognised in its last climate change risk assessment 5 years ago that overheating was a problem. And yet we have only just had a consultation on building regulation changes, and actually no changes have yet occurred. That means we've built nearly 500,000 new homes which are locked in to overheating and will need expensive future retrofit. We need, as Lord Deben says, we need to adapt our natural environment if it's to be able to make the contribution to sequestering carbon, to taking carbon out of the atmosphere that we need it to do for us to deliver our net zero plans. And a crucial part of that is the ability of our peatlands to store carbon. And yet the government's peat action plan commits to only a further 8% restoration of peat by 2025, whereas we believe that we need 100% restoration by 2045, and we need to be at least 17% restoration, more than double the government's commitment by 2025. This is too little and too slow. We cannot meet net zero without adaptation, but even on a net zero pathway, we still need adaptation because we will see some quite significant further changes in our climate to 2050 and beyond. The government needs to present a vision for a well-adapted UK. It's a very positive vision. It's a vision of a greener, a much greener land where we can still live comfortably with the climate change that will come from being on the net zero pathway. But as Lord Deben has says, in order to get there, it is absolutely crucial that climate change and the resilience that we need are embedded in every piece of government policy. And it's urgent because we have some really key pieces of policy and legislation coming up which could help to deliver this vision and to deliver net zero. And those are things like the Environment Bill, currently in the House of Lords, the Planning Bill that Lord Deben has mentioned, and of course, the Net Zero Strategy. All of them need to be delivering net zero and a resilient Britain. Thank you. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Julia. And thanks so much, John, as well. Really excellent introduction to the reports that we are publishing today. Now, on to the main topic this morning, certainly in the first half of our session, our presentation of the key findings of the two reports that we are publishing today. We will hear shortly from David Joffe, our Head of Carbon Budgets, and then from Catherine Brown, our Head of Adaptation. Just a reminder from me that we'd absolutely love to have your questions on all of the content that we are publishing today and anything you've heard this morning. I can see already you're not disappointing on the questions, so we've got, it looks like 23 questions already rolling in. Keep that coming. So as you hear the presentations this morning, we'd love to hear your response on any questions that you have for us. We can pick up in the Q&A. So let's move now to David Joffe, who is our Head of Carbon Budgets, and he led the work that we are publishing today on the progress on reducing emissions in the UK. So over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Chris. So to start off with, we will show the slide that we normally show at the beginning of a progress report, but it's quite a different context this year. It's difficult to shy away from the fact that 2020 was quite an unusual year. Clearly, that affected the UK's GDP. It also affected the UK's emissions. Emissions in the UK in 2020 were 13% down on the previous year and were 48% below 1990 levels. So we're nearly 50% below 1990 emissions, but the job of net zero is nowhere near halfway done. If we look at the emissions reduction that we saw in 2020 in the context then of sector by sector progress, we start by looking at the success story that Lord Deben mentioned moments ago. This is really exciting, the success that we've had in reducing emissions from electricity generation, something around a 70% reduction in those emissions in the last 8 or 9 years. That's really excellent progress and shows what a comprehensive policy package can achieve. However, if we look at emissions across the other sectors, the progress has been much less good across land use and agriculture, surface transport, buildings and other areas. So this is the context in which we find ourselves. We show analysis in this report that says if we continue at those pre-pandemic rates of emissions reduction in these other sectors, and we run out of road as we will on reducing emissions from electricity generation, emissions in 2035, the middle of the 6th carbon budget period, will be double the level that they need to be to meet that carbon budget. So we are not anywhere near where we need to be in terms of progress outside electricity generation. Moving on then specifically to 2020, we can see unsurprisingly the biggest reduction in emissions in 2020 were in the transport sectors because of the travel restrictions and so on that we have endured in that period. And that's in a context of essentially no progress in reducing emissions in the transport sector over the preceding decade. We saw a 60% reduction in aviation emissions last year, and that's it within a total transport sector that saw a 29% reduction overall in its emissions. That's clearly a one-off, and we will expect a rebound in those emissions. If we contrast that, though, with the electricity supply sector, we actually saw less of a reduction in electricity generation emissions last year than we had on average in the preceding 10 years, despite the fact that electricity demand fell significantly due to the reduction in economic activity related to the lockdowns. So that really does show that we are running out of road in electricity generation. As I said, we can expect a rebound in transport emissions, and therefore possibly overall emissions may go up in 2021 compared to 2020. That won't suddenly mean that we're off track in terms of our targets any more than the 13% reduction that we saw last year means that we're suddenly ahead of schedule. Moving on then to the policy, to the ambition the government has announced. The government has announced ambitions in a range of areas, and we distinguish here between announced ambitions in terms of what the government would like to happen, and then the detailed policy to deliver on those ambitions. So presenting ambition first, what we see here in this graph as it builds up, the purple line here is our path for emissions to meet the 2030 NDC, to meet the 6th carbon budget, and the dashed line along the top is what would happen in the absence of climate policy. We've then taken our analysis for the 6th carbon budget, because we don't have a quantified government plan yet to meet the targets, and categorised those emissions reductions required into 4 categories: fully on track, potentially on track, some action but risk of falling behind, and falling behind. And I will allow that to fill up for you. So what we see here is just under half of the emissions reductions that we need to meet the 6th carbon budget have ambitions that are broadly suitable, either fully on track or potentially on track. And more ambitions are actually lacking there, either orange or red in this graph, where we just haven't yet seen the government commitments to the action required. That is a concern, and clearly those orange and red wedges will need to be significantly reduced over the coming months, and essentially disappearing by the time we get the net zero strategy before COP26. If we dig into those specific commitments the government's made, there have been welcome commitments on things such as offshore wind, on electric vehicles, on hydrogen production, and on tree planting at least to 2025. But there's also an emerging picture here where government commitments are coming relatively late, and when they do appear, they're often falling short of the mark. The chart on the right here compares the commitments that the government has made to what's in our pathway to meet the targets, and you can see that across a range of areas we are falling short in terms of what the government has announced. Now, it's part of the design of the Climate Change Act that the targets do not need to be met in exactly the way that the Climate Change Committee recommends. The government does have scope to deviate from that, but it has to be in a credible way. And if it is doing less in these areas, it would need to do more in other areas to compensate. The trouble with that is that our pathway is already stretching in every area by design, so it's going to be difficult for the government to find other areas to outperform in order to allow this shortfall. We will therefore need to see either these commitments being strengthened in the net zero strategy, or the government finding ways to go beyond our pathway elsewhere. Moving on to policy, we have taken our 92 recommendations from last year's progress report and rated government progress on achieving those. We've done that by government department, as you can see here, and the overall picture is mixed, it's fair to say. The positive news is that over 75% of those recommendations have either been fully achieved, are underway, or have been partly achieved. So there are clear signs of a lot of activity across government. However, you can also see that there's relatively little green on this chart, that only 11 of the 92 recommendations have been achieved in full. As Lord Deben mentioned, there's been relatively poor progress from MHCLG and from DEFRA. We haven't yet seen the heat and building strategy from BEIS, although BEIS's progress is one of the stronger departments. Again, we haven't seen the full net zero review from the Treasury over 2 years after we recommended it be undertaken and a year after it was due. So there are concerns here, and it's a mixed picture across departments. There are signs of a multi-speed approach within government to tackling climate change. If we then look at the wedge chart for policies, it's the same format as the ambition chart. We see a less impressive picture than we saw for ambition, and that's not surprising. We would always expect the detailed policy implementation to lag the high-level commitments that have been made. But this is quite concerning. We see around 20% of the emissions reduction that we need to meet the sixth carbon budget essentially having no viable policy framework in place to deliver. Another 20% is broadly on track, either fully or potentially on track at the top. And then we have this middle orange wedge that's around 3/5 of the emissions reduction, where there's something going on, but it's a bit late or it's a bit partial, and we're just not getting the policy framework that we need fully to drive progress here. We are off track for the fourth carbon budget. We are not yet on track for the sixth carbon budget, and we will need to see the policies and proposals that the government is required to set out to meet that, and we are not on track to net zero as things stand. So how do we get on track to net zero? Net zero strategy before COP26 will be absolutely essential. That needs not only to set out quantified pathways to net zero and to meeting the sixth carbon budget, but also needs to tackle a range of cross-cutting issues and gaps in policy. If we go to the cross-cutting priorities first, the net zero strategy needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to set out how government policy and government decisions are going to be fully compliant with net zero. We need a plan for a just transition and for how the costs of the transition are going to be allocated fairly across society. Public engagement is crucial, not only for people to understand the changes that are required and how they can contribute, but also for them to have a say in how decisions are made. Decisions that will include how we heat our homes, for example, in a low carbon way, and those may be local decisions with different solutions in different parts of the country. As Baroness Brown emphasised, the strategy must be integrated with climate adaptation, or we won't get to net zero. I won't go through each of the essential elements of the transition in detail, but you can see there's some pretty big areas there to achieve, and those are each crucial to meeting net zero. Finally, I want to highlight 4 major gaps that we've identified. In December, we recommended, as part of our advice on the sixth carbon budget, that the government commit to phasing out unabated use of fossil fuel electricity generation by 2035. We haven't yet heard anything from the government on that, so that is a gap. We're also seeing a gap on the demand side. The government has not made any commitments around, for example, the contributions of diet change or of walking and cycling to meeting the targets. But these are not just important in terms of the emissions reductions that we'll see, they're also important in terms of the wider benefits of the transition, the health and well-being improvements that we can get from having healthier diets and taking more exercise. We're worried about a trend that's going in the wrong direction in the waste sector. Recycling rates have stalled and more energy from waste facilities are being built. More waste is going to those facilities. we need to redouble our efforts on recycling and push those rates up. We also need a plan for what to do about the emissions from those energy from waste facilities, and increasingly to start capturing the CO2 that comes from them. Finally, although it's extremely welcome that the government has legislated the 6th carbon budget now at the level we recommended, and including emissions from international aviation and international shipping for the first time, we now need a strategy for how we're going to achieve those emissions reductions in the aviation sector. Finally, I will just talk through what's next for the committee. We have done quite a lot in the way of target setting over the last 2 or 3 years, and that phase of our work is now over for the time being. We're now much more focused on delivery and on monitoring government progress, but that's not just about sectoral emissions reductions and deployment of technology. There's a range of issues that underpin the transition. I won't talk in detail to each of these, but just to flag, we're interested in the governance of the transition. There's been some progress, but there's still a big policy gap, as I outlined. We need the just transition, and it needs to be joined up with the levelling up agenda. People and engagement are highlighted, but there's a big gap between where people are now and where they need to get to. Business action, again, there's a lot of enthusiasm out there, but overall more needs to be done. Local action, again, a lot of commitment, a lot of enthusiasm. The key will be harnessing that commitment in order to better and more effectively make the reductions that we need. Finance, again, progress is being made, but it's not embedded into routine decisions. And finally, international action, again, lots of progress there. The US is back in the Paris Agreement. We are making commitments as a globe, but the delivery on those will need to be a lot better than it has been. I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, David. So I think if we can move on then to Catherine, who's going to flip to the other side of the house now and give us a sense of where we stand on adaptation progress. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good morning, everybody. So as Chris said, I'm going to just cover the other side of the bumper pack that we've published this year, both on mitigation, and there's a 250-page adaptation report that's published today as well. So I'm going to try and go through that 250 pages in just under 10 minutes. And really also to bring out some of the linkages that we're highlighting quite strongly between the two reports this year. And this is the first one really about why we need to do adaptation and mitigation together in order to address climate change. And this is a chart that many of you will be familiar with. So it shows two pathways of global temperature compared to pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement scenario, which is the orange bar and the uncertainty around it, keeps us below a 2-degree level of global warming by 2100. But the point to make here for adaptation is that we see continued warming between now and at least 2050. And then we see that level of warming continue out to 2100. And we looked at this very carefully in the climate change risk assessment, which we published last week. And we know that the hazards from heat, from flooding, from drought, and from wildfire are going to keep increasing. We know things like a 2018 summer, which many of you will remember was an extremely hot summer. That's projected to be an average summer by 2050. And we know that the costs from climate change are going to keep increasing, even in this very ambitious global scenario. So the CCRA analysis published last week showed a tripling of the damage costs in the 2-degree scenario by 2100. And for adaptation planning, this is not the only scenario we need to think about. We need to think about a high scenario where we don't see countries meeting their net zero targets. And this is the blue line with the uncertainty range around it as well. And this assumes that we see a continuation, what we call a continuation of current global ambitions. So we see the level of implementation of policies that we've seen in the recent past continuing. And what we see there is that global temperatures exceed 3 degrees by 2100 and could even exceed 4 degrees if you look at the uncertainty range. This is not a world that we want to be in. at the end of the century, but it is a world we have to think about in adaptation planning for the UK. And we use this range between 2 degrees and 4 degrees to frame our assessment of adaptation progress, which I'll show you next. So this is our assessment framework for adaptation. It's a little bit different to mitigation because we're looking at different metrics and different types of policy. So what this is, we have a 9-box grid, and we assess all the different sectors on adaptation on 2 axes. So one is the quality of plans that are coming out on adaptation. And this is looking at things like, as I said, whether we see planning for what we call the inevitable level of climate change, which roughly is between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, whether we see sensible measurable actions that are related to specific goals, and whether we see monitoring and evaluation frameworks in place. And then along the x-axis here, we also look at measuring progress in managing risk itself. So are there demonstrable actions that are lowering vulnerability and exposure to climate risk now and going into the future? So that's our assessment framework, and we give scores out of 9. Obviously 9 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. And this is the results of our assessment for this year. So in the report, we go through sector by sector for each one of these 34 adaptation priorities. We explain the score and then we give our analysis, and that's what makes up the report. And there's 3 things to note with this chart. So the first is that there's actually very little change since 2019, since our last report on adaptation progress, which does suggest that the current version of the government's national adaptation programme is not driving that sort of level of action we need to see to bring up ambition and implementation on adaptation, as Julia was saying. The second thing to note is that there are still no sectors in the left-hand column, and that means that we haven't been able to find enough evidence to say that any of the plans and actions in place are demonstrating a high level of risk reduction, that we're seeing vulnerability and exposure across all of our indicators coming down for any of these sectors. And the other thing to note is that there are 9 sectors in the top row that either score a 1 or a 2, where we're not even seeing plans for the minimum level of climate change we expect, the inevitable level, let alone these higher levels of warming. Now, there are some small signs of progress, and we do want to highlight these, and we've talked about these a lot in the report. And these 5 sectors I'm highlighting here have all been given improved scores. So things like commercial fisheries and aquaculture, we've seen climate change included in the Fisheries Act. There's new actions for the Marine Management Organisation that now has to produce an adaptation plan. We've seen a lot of progress in government action to support businesses to think about climate risk, primarily through the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which includes both adaptation and mitigation, and further work to look at things like supply chains. So, for example, the National Food Strategy, the first part of that has been published in the last year. And the second part will be coming out shortly as well, that will include a lot more on climate change. And the one I'd just like to highlight a little bit further is flood risk. Now, there is still a mixed picture on flood risk, but we have seen very significant progress in planning for flood risk, both river and coastal flood alleviation and surface water as well. And just taking you to the next slide, just to show you one of our indicators that we look at for that. So last year, the Environment Agency published its new flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy alongside a policy statement that was published by government. And alongside that, there was a commitment to a new capital funding regime, which gave £5.2 billion in capital funding over the next 6 years towards building new flood defences effectively. And this is our indicator of flood defence spending. So the purple bar is the capital funding, and you can see that that's on an upward trajectory, which is great and which is what we would like to see. It's not the whole picture. So if you look at sorry, it's not coming out. There we go. The other side of flood funding, this is revenue funding in the pink bars and the local levy funding in the yellow bars. And here we see more of a mixed picture. And the point here is that we don't yet know for the coming 6-year period what that funding is going to look like, because it is only agreed on a year-by-year basis, whereas the capital funding is agreed in 5-year blocks going forward. If we see levels of funding that are similar to what we've seen in the recent past, then we would expect over the next 6-year period that flood funding in England is going to hit the Environment Agency's optimal pathway for flood investment, and that's the range between the diamond and the square shown on this graph. And this is where effectively benefits are maximised over costs when investing in flood funding. But we don't yet know. So that's a picture that is still uncertain. And this year-on-year allocation, rather than a longer-term funding formula, does create increased uncertainty on whether we're going to see that coming forward or not. And then moving on to the rest of the picture. So we have seen some progress, as I've said, but it is quite small and it is a minority of the sectors we look at. So for 29 of the 34 adaptation priorities, we haven't been able to improve the scores since 2019. And in particular, I just wanted to highlight some of our indicators which are not yet going in the right direction. So this indicator is one we've highlighted more in the climate change risk assessment, and we've highlighted in our progress report this year as well. This is wildfire risk across the UK. And as you can see from this chart, we've seen a big increase in wildfire impact in the total area burnt since 2015. In 2019, it was the highest recorded ever area of wildfire incidents across the UK, nearly 30,000 hectares, which is the size of a city region. So if you imagine, I mean, we often don't see these fires happening, but if you imagine the area the size of a city region on fire, that is what we saw in 2019. And this has significant implications for meeting net zero, because a lot of these fires are happening on peatland as well as in woodland. And when they happen, we see very significant carbon emissions coming from these fires. And this is part of the adaptation story, that we need to get much better at raising public awareness, at putting in place plans to reduce the impact of wildfires when they happen, and in understanding more about future projections of them as well. And this isn't the only indicator where we are concerned in the adaptation report this year. Urban green space is still not going in the right direction. We've seen a record number of heat-related deaths in 2020, which we haven't seen before. And as Julia mentioned, we're only just starting to see, although it's incredibly welcome to see some policy action coming through on that, there's still a long way to go. We haven't seen good trends in things like some of the infrastructure condition metrics, so things like road condition, and we're seeing some very concerning trends in the natural environment, so habitat condition in both terrestrial and freshwater habitats. And again, there's a lot of activity underway in DEFRA, but it's not yet clear that that activity is integrating adaptation as much as it needs to. So just going on to my last slide, those of you that looked at the climate change risk assessment last week and joined our launch for that will have seen this, which is our assessment of the highest priority areas for action in the next 2 years. That assessment was at the UK level, and this progress report is just for England. So in the progress report, we've taken these 8 key areas, applied them to England, and given over 50 recommendations, department by department again, on the action that needs to be taken in the next 2-year period. So just to run through these very quickly, the first 4 were all about the natural environment. So risks to terrestrial and freshwater habitats, risks to soil health, to natural carbon stores, and to agriculture and forestry productivity as well. And then we had 4 other priority areas across different parts of the risk assessment, different sectors. So risks to supply chains, including food, risks to the power system from weather-related impacts, and the much bigger impact that will have as we transition towards net zero and we become more reliant on the electricity system. As we've already mentioned, risks to human health from extreme heat in homes and in other buildings, including hospitals and care homes. That has always been one of our top priorities, and it is still there. We still haven't quite seen yet this shift in policy we need to see that being addressed. And then finally, multiple risks to the UK from climate change overseas, which is partly about things like food security, conflict overseas, but these all need a cross-government response. These are not DEFRA-led policy areas in the round. Some of them are, but we make very clear in the report that every department has adaptation responsibilities that it needs to implement, and we make recommendations across infrastructure and buildings, across business, across health, and a few overall recommendations to try and encourage government to increase the ambition and the level of implementation of the future national adaptation programme as well. Just 2 of those to pick out finally. One is that we're very keen to see a stronger resilience capability coming through from government, led by Cabinet Office, to think about how to predict climate shocks, but also to set in place a much stronger effective resilience function across government. And we would like to see a public awareness campaign on adaptation. We've been calling for this for years. We've seen a fantastic climate assembly on net zero, but that hasn't yet been followed up with one for adaptation, and that's something we'd like to see. And just to reiterate Julia's point to finish, we will not achieve net zero if we do not adapt. You can see some of these priorities in this slide are about achieving net zero: agricultural productivity, natural carbon stores, soil health, and there's a whole range of other policy goals that we will not achieve either if we do not up ambition on adaptation, whether that's food security, safe infrastructure, or a healthy and diverse population. So with that, I'll hand back to Chris.
Thanks so much, Catherine. My thanks to David and Catherine for presenting that this morning. And also personal thanks from me to the CCC team. So we're only a small team and they've all worked incredibly hard to produce this analysis and these reports. So it's been a year of contradictions. We've seen some genuinely historic commitments, and I'm pleased to say that they have been on our advice. So we've got the new UK legal targets for emissions. We have the new 2030 NDC target announced by the Prime Minister last year. All of that is great. I'm personally delighted that we brought aviation emissions into the UK's carbon budgets, and that is, a long-running recommendation that I'm so pleased that we've got now. We had the Prime Minister's 10-point plan late last year, and I remember at the time thinking that was a big moment. It felt like we were really motoring at that point. But I'm afraid, aside from that, there is very little of the promised new policy that we have been promised from government. So we're highlighting in these reports the gulf that there now is between the government's commitments, which are often projected to a global audience, not just at home, and the action on the ground to actually deliver against those commitments. We've had delays to some essential legislation on the environment. We've had delays to the promised strategy to decarbonise homes and buildings. We are still awaiting our Treasury net zero funding review that was committed to 2 years ago after we completed the net zero report. The transport decarbonisation plan is still slated for spring 2021, so it's a long spring that we are having today. There is a pattern emerging, I'm afraid, of government strategies that are late, and then when we see them, they're short of the required policy ambition. And I think that's creating a vacuum, which is now being filled by some of the naysayers, the people who'd rather we didn't bother with all this climate stuff. So we really need a better strategy on this. We need that net zero strategy that has been promised by the government, and it has to be before COP26. That is urgent. And the government has really started to put all of its emphasis now on that strategy. So it's going to have to deliver a lot. I want to kill any suggestion before we have it that can wait. That has to happen before COP26. It needs to be backed by a notably silent Treasury and Chancellor on that too. So that is something that we are really, really keen to see. We are suggesting in our reports today that we can have a net zero test for policy and planning, making sure that this is this test that we can apply, putting it at the forefront of policymakers' minds across government, crucial to seeing that we make progress on net zero. And it's a simple question of, does this fit with net zero that we're asking for here? And we want to hammer home this message, you've heard it already 2 or 3 times today, on the need for an integrated approach to climate risk and adaptation and emissions reduction. And achieving net zero very much does rest on successful adaptation, building, renovating homes that are energy efficient and safely adapted for higher temperatures in the future, constructing a net zero power system that's resilient to climate change, because we're going to be needing that power and more reliant on it in the future, making sure that we plan for all the tree planting and peatland restoration that we need on the basis of the change in climate that is coming by mid-century. So we need that focus on net zero and adaptation as we get to COP26 and then as we enter the next cycle of planning and policy. So please read our reports. If you have the time, they are very readable, I think, and they contain much more than you've heard this morning. So we now move on to the Q&A, and I can see already we're almost at the magic number of 100 questions. And I am so pleased that we are going to be joined now by Tim Harford, who's a favourite of all the CCC staffers. I'm sure you'll know Tim. He's the undercover economist. He's a Financial Times columnist. He's a BBC broadcaster. And he's the author of 9 books, including most recently, How to Make the World Add Up. He's also kept me sane throughout lockdown with his podcasts. So cautionary tales and that regular slot that he does on Radio 4 on More or Less. is wonderful stuff. So thank you, Tim, for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to you now to try and wade your way through those questions. Thanks, Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in, and thanks to the panel who, unlike certain politicians, have in fact kept to their commitments to finish on time and hand over for Q&A. As Chris mentioned, we have nearly 100 questions have come in already. There is also, as well as asking further questions, one thing you might usefully do is have a look at a question you think is really important, but hasn't got a lot of upvotes, and maybe vote it up, because I'll be looking obviously at towards the top of the list of questions. But before I get to your questions, I wanted to ask a couple of my own, if that's permissible. And Lord Deben, you opened your remarks by saying that Boris Johnson had made historic promises, and elsewhere you said that the government had made extraordinary commitments. And given the year we've all just had, I feel I have mixed feelings about historic promises and extraordinary commitments from politicians. And Boris Johnson made the extraordinary promise that we were going to get a world-beating test, track and trace system within weeks. He promised that in May. Matt Hancock said we were going to hit 100,000 COVID tests a day by the end of April. We didn't. I mean, he said we did, but we didn't. In terms of climate change, the problem is, I would have thought, much more severe, since we can at least hold these politicians accountable now for making promises that they weren't able to fulfill. But a lot of the promises that we're talking are promises to hit targets in 2050, 2035. So why is there so much focus on targets and promises and so little focus on actual policies that might achieve something?
Well, you're quite right that the most important thing is actually the policies that will achieve the things. But of course, there's a difference in these promises because they are statutory. We now have a legal requirement to reach net zero in 2050. We have legal requirements to meet our budgets. And if the government doesn't meet the budgets, and it's not on course for meeting the fourth carbon budget or the fifth carbon budget, if it is not, it is then subject to the law. So it puts itself, it's done so purposely, within the context of legal liability. Now, it wouldn't be us that took them to the courts, but if they were taken to the courts, I'm afraid I might well be first witness for the prosecution. The truth is, they have got to get this right. But there's a second reason, and that is that this government has made a great deal about global Britain. Now, we can all have our arguments about whether leaving the European Union was a good thing. I think it was a thoroughly dangerous and wrong thing, but we've done that. So this is the first test as to whether global Britain is going to operate. It seems to me quite clear that the government has got to make a success of COP26. Now, you don't make a success of that on promises. You have to make a success of it on actual delivery. So I personally believe that the government will step up to this, but it's our job to point out precisely what it has to do to deliver what it has promised to do.
Thank you very much. And Baroness Brown, I've been looking at the questions that have come in. Lots and lots of great questions, very few on adaptation. Is it fair to say that there's just not as much focus in the media, in the popular imagination, in policy on adaptation as there is on emissions reduction? And if that is a fair comment, then why do you think that is?
I think that's an absolutely fair comment. In my forward to the report we published last week, the evidence for on the climate change risk assessment, I describe adaptation as the Cinderella of climate change. We suddenly get focused on adaptation when we have a very hot summer or when we have flooding, but the rest of the time it disappears, and that makes it. I think that makes it quite difficult in a way for governments to feel the sense of urgency about making investment. The one area where we now have some good progress, as we've heard, is the flood and coastal erosion management strategy, with the commitment for higher capital expenditure going into the future. but actually overheating in homes kills far more people than flooding in this country. And we have this woeful slow progress in terms of doing anything about it. So it's partly the probabilistic nature of climate and weather, but and it's partly the fact that we need to be investing now to protect ourselves against things that will happen in the future. But when you look at the cost effectiveness of that, we did a big analysis of wherever data was available, looking at as Catherine mentioned, looking at the benefit cost ratio of taking adaptation actions, and for almost all the areas we looked at, those benefit cost ratios are greater than 1, and some of them are well above 10. So these are investments we really do need to be making, and the sooner we make them, the cheaper it is.
Well, thank you. If I could hold on the subject of adaptation for a moment and ask a question to Catherine Brown. I'm still slightly puzzled as to why this seems to be such a problem. I mean, I can see why emissions reduction is a problem, because if I stick a solar panel on my house, then the main benefit to that is, somebody in 50 years' time on the other side of the world. I mean, there's this enormous global commons problem that's very, very well understood. But if I insulate my house to prevent against extreme heat, or I put, if I emulate you and I put creepers on the walls, or I flood-proof my home, I mean, that's a direct benefit to me. And within a local authority, actions that the local authority takes directly benefit the residents there. And within a nation state, actions that the government take directly benefit that nation state. It seems like it should be a much easier problem, but we don't seem to be finding it easier.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tim, and we agree with that. Adaptation is about protecting yourself and your community and your natural environment against the risks from climate change. So it is a much more local issue in some ways than mitigation. And I mean, based on our analysis, we think part of the problem is a lack of information being given to the public about what they can do. When we launched the risk assessment last week, some of the radio broadcast that we did, people were ringing in and talking about the adaptation measures they've undertaken. And that was really fascinating to see that people are thinking about shading. They are thinking about, whether fans work or not, and should they be installing shutters. That's really great. But I don't think the government has done any assessment of how far that action is happening at the individual level. So that's one thing, is we want to see a much better public awareness campaign, as I mentioned. And the other part of it is not everybody is able to take actions to protect themselves. Some measures to reduce the risk of overheating are expensive. Putting shutters in your house is a really effective measure, but shutters are very expensive for those of us that have bought them in the past. And for people living in blocks of flats, and for people renting and leaseholders in particular, it's almost impossible to make structural changes to your home, whether that's for overheating or flood risk or water scarcity. And it's those areas where we need to see government action coming through much more strongly to help people to make sure that they are resilient with themselves. So those two things, further government intervention where there are barriers for people to be able to help themselves, and better public awareness are the two things we're calling for in the report.
Thank you. David, one of the things that really struck me about your presentation, and I'm slightly exaggerating, but only a little, is that we've made phenomenal progress in the electricity system, and no progress at all anywhere else. That is a mild exaggeration, but I don't think it's a grotesque distortion of the data that you've shown us. What are the lessons we should learn from that? What is it about the electricity system that made it easier? Is it that the policy levers work better? Is it that we've enjoyed a technological windfall that maybe we don't fully deserve, or is there some other reason?
Thanks, Tim. I think there's multiple reasons here. One of the most important things here is that climate policy to date has tried to change things in a way that people don't notice. So, you don't necessarily notice that more than half of the electricity now that comes to your house is low carbon. You will notice no difference from 10 years ago when it was much higher carbon. That is, if not a deliberate strategy from government, then at least something where they have avoided engaging with people and things that need changes to people's lives. I think there are also differences in terms of the technologies that are available in the power sector, but that's a secondary matter. The other thing to say, of course, is that we've had, unlike in many other sectors, we've actually had a comprehensive policy package in electricity for the best part of a decade. And we see that peak in emissions that we had in 2012 in electricity generation. Emissions then came down rapidly as we've had the combination of the contracts for renewable power generation, the carbon pricing that pushes coal to the margins of the system, the demand side mainly through appliance regulation standards to reduce demand there, all while maintaining security of supply by having a capacity mechanism. So that's the kind of comprehensive policy package that we need to see in other sectors, but we haven't seen so far. I don't know why that is, but some of the observations I made earlier might allude to it.
Thank you. Chris, maybe I can throw a question at you before I turn to questions from people who are watching online. David just mentioned carbon pricing then. It wasn't mentioned very much in any of the presentations. I don't think a carbon tax was mentioned at all. I may have missed it. I know I'm sounding like a Gen X economist at this point, but carbon pricing, I mean, it's obvious. We've known this since we thought climate change was an issue. We've known this since the 1920s. Like, this is the obvious policy lever. So why not mentioned? Is it because like carbon prices are not what the cool kids believe in anymore? Is it because why so little talk of carbon pricing?
Well, I think, all the cool cats still like carbon pricing. So I think it's important to say that carbon pricing is an absolutely essential component of the transition that we've got to make over the course of the next few years. Now, we've had those carbon pricing signals in UK policy for a number of years. If you look at the Climate Change Act, it's based on the existence of an emissions trading scheme. We've got other carbon pricing taxes and signals throughout the system. I think the thing to say on it is, well, maybe two things. Firstly, what we have at the moment is a mess. So, we're not putting the carbon prices in the right places. It's fairly obvious that the Treasury needs to do a full review of that. One really important reason why they need to do that review is that if the Prime Minister is correct and we all transition to electric vehicles, as I very much hope we do, then the Chancellor's going to have a major hole in his budget. So we're not going to be raising lots of money from fuel duty.
He's already got one, Chris, I'm afraid.
Well, he's got several, and he's creating a new one, a real new fiscal risk. And the other thing to say is, you were hinting at it, and perhaps in your question, Tim, it's not the panacea. I think maybe 20 years ago, when you asked people about, you asked economists certainly about carbon pricing, it was projected as a sort of catch-all perfect answer to how we can decarbonise the global economy or the UK economy, whoever you asked. Actually, that doesn't turn out to be true. I think it is. I think of it more and more as a kind of component of the set of policies that we need. But actually, there are quicker ways to decarbonise in some sectors and in some circumstances. So just go back to that issue of electric cars. You could try and decarbonise the surface transport fleet by fuel duty escalator rising over time. It turns out that's not a very popular policy, and no Chancellor has been keen to do it for several years now. Or you can say, by 2030, we're going to phase out the sale of petrol and diesel cars and vans. Every manufacturer then knows what they need to deliver by that point, and crucially, so does the consumer and so does the motorist. So it turns out that a mixture of these things, regulatory policy, the rules, of course, as well, and the laws, and these carbon pricing mechanisms is the thing that really drives progress. You can actually see that in the story on the power sector that David talked about. It's a mixture of carbon taxation and carbon pricing, plus some regulations to phase out some of the most dirty electric generating plants coming from Europe, that legislation. So it's that idea of a kind of mix of policies that I think that will drive real progress overall. The last thing I'll say on this is that when we look at across the whole of the economy, these key phase-out dates start to really matter. So if you want to have a smooth transition to net zero on time, on the pathway that we've recommended and on the pathway that the government has now accepted and put into law, then what you really need to be thinking about is this kind of key date around 2030. That's the point when we need to stop selling high carbon assets and start selling only zero carbon assets. Now, it's slightly earlier in some sectors, it's slightly later in other sectors, but if you want that kind of transition to be smooth, if we don't have lots of stranded assets, then we need to be planning for that, so that from 2030 onwards, we really get motoring on the emissions reduction as those assets start to flow through the economy. That tends to be the kind of policy overall that lends itself more to regulatory intervention, again, backed by sharper carbon pricing. So I hope the Chancellor's thinking about all this. I mentioned in my comments that there is this gap now, this vacuum that's not being filled by the Chancellor. He could really own this space and set out what his plan is to try and bring about all this investment. I would love that.
Thanks very much, Chris. So I'm now going to turn to your questions. There have now been well over 100 questions asked. Feel free to have a look and upvote questions that you think aren't getting enough attention. But let me put the first question to Lord Deben, but other members of the panel, if you really feel there's something important that you want to add, just wave and I'll come to you. But so the top question is from David Royal, who refers to the government response to the latest report. And the government response was, any suggestion that we have been slow to deliver climate action is widely off the mark. Now, David adds, plainly they're in denial. How do we change this defensive attitude? Well, I wanted to supplement that question, Lord Deben. Do you think they are in denial, or do you think they are just denying? I mean, if it's a different thing, do you think they think they're doing a good job, or are they just claiming they're doing a good job?
Well, I don't know where this particular government response to the piece in The Guardian actually came from. And it looks to me like a hastily gathered comment by some press reporter. I'm not at all sure that I'd take it absolutely seriously, because after all, it refers to the things we all know and then says, well, yeah, they're going to bring things forward, which is exactly the point that we were making, that they haven't brought those things forward and they haven't got it right. I don't think the government's in denial. I think the fact of the matter is that it hasn't applied itself with enough effort in many departments to get this done on time. DEFRA, for example, is one of the two departments most involved in this, and yet it has no program for net zero at all. So people can't make decisions. How can people work if they don't know what the government program is? We've already mentioned education. Education has a Secretary of State who's made no statement about climate change and the centrality of that to education and training. We've got MHCLG, which is producing a new planning bill, but there is no sign so far that that bill will have as a central point that every planning application has got to think seriously about its effect on climate change. All those things are not there yet. They're not there yet, not because the government's in denial, but because the government has not yet done what it knows it has to do. And what I hope is that this report will give it the impetus to ensure that it does the key things before the COP26, which is actually to get a proper, fully covering net zero policy program and series of actual delivery points so that we know where we are.
Thank you very much. So the question has come in from Hayley Fowler and has been shooting up the charts. Everyone likes Hayley's question. And she says, local authorities seem to be leading the way in mitigation and adaptation planning. And actually, before finishing the question, I find that a very interesting observation. My personal observation, and this I know is anecdotal, N of 1, is that having recently renovated my house and tried to get a new car, I found it extremely difficult to get any support from the local authority. Like, we weren't allowed to charge an electric car by stringing a cable across the pavement. That was, that just wasn't possible. So, and there are no charging points. So how are you going to get an electric car? We couldn't put solar panels on our roof. We weren't allowed to replace beautiful old single glazed windows with ugly double glazed windows. I mean, we replaced them in the end with beautiful double glazed windows, but they were extremely expensive, and the planners were very happy to just stick with single glazing as long as the appearance of the house was not damaged, and so on and so on. There was a lot of that. But I'm glad that Haley's general view is that that's an anomalous, and local authorities are leading the way. So she goes on to add, how can we get more support from national government for these local scale actions that have so much influence? And how can we use these to effectively change national policies that are barriers to net zero planning? I'm not sure who is best positioned on the panel to answer this question. Baroness Brown, you've unmuted yourself. That's your signal. What do you reckon?
I think there are some fantastic examples around the country of local authorities who are really getting to grips with this, and particularly perhaps and more unusually on the adaptation front. And I would like to flag up and give a gold star to Kent County Council, who have done some outstanding work in trialling special planting of street trees in Margate, which are planted in sort of boxes which enable them to be both part of a making the streets flood resilient, whilst also providing shading for many of the elderly residents of Margate to encourage them to come out walking in good weather. They have schemes to work with their farmers to help them understand both the changes in temperature and drought, and how to manage the land, but also how to benefit from the longer growth, the longer growing period, and to move to crops like, you know, potentially apricots and peaches, some of the things we can grow in hotter climates. They have they also have a calculator for looking at the benefit cost ratios and the costs of their climate actions, which is available to local authorities everywhere. And the biggest challenge they have is that they can demonstrate all sorts of exciting initiatives, but they don't get enough money from central government in order to then do those, in order then to spread these excellent initiatives right through their area. So one of the big challenges we have is that local authorities are not measured by central government on their performance on either net zero or adaptation, and indeed they're not properly funded to deliver. But where they do have a chance to deliver, so the element of the Green Homes grant that's been delivered through local authorities has worked very effectively, and government needs to look at what is working and recognise the help that local authorities can be to them in delivering on these tough targets that Chris and David have been talking about, but also on the well-being aspects of adaptation.
And it sounds like something that is partly just all tied up in the lack of funding of local government in general, because it doesn't sound like putting some nice trees in your town is the kind of thing that should really need to be funded by the Treasury. It should be able to find the money locally, but of course there's a big shortage of cash for local authorities. Lord Deben, sorry, but Baroness Brown. No, okay. Lord Deben, you wanted to add something.
Well, just to say that there's no doubt that local authorities are leading the way. There's very few of them that don't have a net zero promise for their own internal arrangements by 2030, and most of them have got a similar one rather later for the whole of their area. But the real problem is that there's no central help at all. I don't mean just money. Why on earth does each one of them have got to find or remake the wheel all the time? Because each one of them's got to find out how they do it. There's nobody in MHCLG who's actually providing the sort of central help and guidance and answering questions. And one of the reasons for that is that they don't even have the answers for themselves. So we've really got to say, and the last thing is, we are not going to reach net zero unless local authorities, regional authorities, and national, in the sense of the devolved nations, unless they're all intimately involved in this. And MHCLG has got to be the key, take that key role. And it's not just about money, and we're not just saying yet again local authorities are improperly supported. It's about leadership and looking as if you really want them to do it. And as Baroness Brown said, measuring them, seeing that what they promise they actually deliver.
Thank you. There's a question from Bob Ward. Chris, maybe you'd like to take a
yeah, of course, Tim.
crack at this. So Bob asks, opponents of climate change action have started a misinformation campaign, aided and abetted by their friends in the media. I don't know whether he's thinking of me or somebody else, but it's good to know it's our fault. And this misinformation campaign is claiming that the costs of achieving net zero emissions are unaffordable for the UK. I should say, by the way, Bob, this sort of misinformation campaign goes back a very long way. I can just plug my book, How to Make the World Add Up. And this all goes back to the 1950s and the smoking industry, and it's kind of rolled on ever since. There's a very familiar playbook being used. But Bob's specific question is, whose job should it be to rebut this campaign? Your job, Chris?
Well, Tim, there's definitely a role for us. Thanks, Bob, for the question. There's a role for us to present the analysis and the information, and we've been trying to do that. But in the end, we're just the advisors. So the central role here is for government, I think, to lead this. And not just lead it, but to own it. So to actually own the discussion, which they're just not doing at the moment. It's a particular role for the Treasury here. And the silence from the Chancellor on this stuff is deafening. So let's knock on the head right now the idea that this is an expensive transition. So no doubt there are costs, but they're very, very small in proportion to the size of the UK economy. We did a little bit of work on this. We've been consistent on this in recent months in the analysis that we produced. But conservatively, we're talking about less than 1% of GDP in every year. So what that means is that getting to if we weren't trying for net zero, we would get to a certain level of GDP by 2050. If we try for net zero, we get to the same level of GDP, but just slightly later, about 4 months later. 4 months later over 30 years. So it's a 4-month delay, and that's if you believe that it is a cost to the economy. In reality, the amount of investment that we need to do, we estimate that an extra £50 billion of investment is necessary across the economy each year. That's what will get us to net zero. Now, there are jobs attached to that. And if you can do that investment when there's spare capacity in the economy, especially as you come out of a pandemic, then there's a big positive impact on GDP that goes with that. How about having a chancellor that owns that story rather than kind of hiding away and not saying anything about it? That's the story that we should have ministers across the piece talking about. Instead of that, you get this vacuum I talked about earlier where this kind of silence, this reluctance to talk about these issues because they're not sure how it lands with a certain proportion of the backbenchers or the voting population. That's being filled now by the naysayers and the bad faith actors who would like to present this as a major cost to the UK economy. It's not. It's not a major cost to the UK economy. It's not a major cost to other major economies either. And of course, the impact of all this, if we don't act, is much, much bigger. Huge cost to the economy if we don't tackle climate change. So I would love to see the Chancellor make a big speech on this, properly own this thing, not kind of reluctantly go along with something that the Prime Minister has signed us up to. So that's the challenge, I think. And in terms of when that speech might come, as soon as possible, really. But we've got the COP26 at the end of the year. It would be great to have the UK's Finance Minister really own the space. I'm sure the US would notice that. I'm sure other economies around the world would notice it too. So I think that is something, the kind of intellectual leadership on that could be owned by the UK, as we have done on previous occasions with things like the Stern Review, which came from the Treasury. So I do put a lot of this, I'm afraid, with ministers and especially with the Chancellor.
Yeah, it is an interesting problem that's been raised here. I mean, when we look back to, for example, the referendum, the Brexit referendum, there were certain statements made that were not true, and you could say, well, whose job is it to rebut those untrue statements? You could say maybe the chair of the UK Statistics Authority, Sir Andrew Dilnot. In fact, he did say that some of these statements were misleading, and the only person who seems to have suffered from that is possibly Sir Andrew Dilnot, the chair of the UK Statistics Authority, because when there's this very highly polarized environment, you can't just have a czar who's in charge of rebutting misinformation. It's more complex than that. But it's a very, very important problem, and thank you for raising it. Now, there's a fascinating question came in that I keep losing because the Q&A is so full of good questions. And I'm going to apologize because oh yeah, no, this question from Keith McLean. And David, maybe you'd like to take a try at answering this. Keith asks, what can we learn from the approach taken with vaccine development and deployment to speed up decision-making and delivery by a factor of 10? So, I mean, as someone who presented a BBC program called How to Vaccinate the World, I think the key decisions in terms of vaccine research where the government put an awful lot of money into it and bet on lots of different possible solutions, didn't just say, well, there's this one thing that's going to save us. They were happy to overinvest and pay the costs of overinvesting and accept that some of that investment would be wasted. And when it comes to deployment, I guess the message was everyone's in this together, and we have a national plan, and we're just going to roll it out according to a national basis. I think most people would say that's been broadly successful. To what extent do those lessons actually carry over to climate change, and to what extent are the problems too different?
Thanks, Tim. I'm glad you had a go at answering the question yourself. You're more expert on the vaccine rollout than I am, certainly.
Well, I answered half of it. You can answer the other half. What does it teach us about climate change?
I'm not sure I can, but I will try. I think, I mean, a lot of the points you've made there are valid. Certainly creating the different options and not just betting on a single horse is really important. And we've been saying for many years we need to take a portfolio approach here to technologies and not just bet on single solutions. I think the laser-like focus on delivery of the vaccination program is really important as well, and that's in sharp contrast, frankly, to what we've seen on climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, I would say. So yes, it's the thing that we've seen with the pandemic is a sudden emergency can create a very big emergency response. People call climate change an emergency, but the reaction that we get from policymakers is not that of an emergency response. I think it is a long-term challenge. We need to do this over decades, but we do need to inject urgency into it in a way that we haven't seen to date.
Yeah, it is a tricky problem. I wrote in a recent column, we will never have a situation where there's a daily press conference where the Prime Minister stands up and says, this is how many people died or lost their jobs or whatever today because of climate change. It's a different kind of problem, and it does make things more challenging. Catherine Brown, a question has come in from Mike Barry, who says, you emphasize the need for citizen engagement and more localized decision-making and action. How do you think we should do this? We've heard a little bit about this from Baroness Brown and Lord Deben, but what else might we try and do to get the local decision makers empowered?
I mean, I'll reply on adaptation, and then maybe someone else would like to pick it up on mitigation as well, because it's probably slightly different. On adaptation, we've seen a lot of it comes down to the governance structure, so that you have a very good underpinning framework in place that allows people to get the information they need to make the decisions that they need to make, and that's backed up by funding as well. And we have seen that in the past in the UK, and I'll just talk about England because this progress report is about England. But 10 years ago we had a good public information business support service. We had regional climate change partnerships that were based in local authorities and environment agency offices. We had good funding going through to local authorities, and picking up on an earlier point, we had indicators to see what local authorities were doing on adaptation. That's all been stripped away in the last 10 years for various reasons. And now there isn't a single place that people can go to get information. There isn't funding streams that are dedicated to adaptation. And our analysis suggests, and we picked this up in the last report as well, that framework, although it sounds procedural, it is for adaptation really critical, because adaptation is such a local issue that the way you adapt is different in different places. So unlike mitigation, it's harder to say we're going to have a national uptake of X, and we just measure that national uptake. You need to think about local circumstances much more, because different places are subject to different hazards. You have different populations, you have different levels of inequality. Obviously, these all need to come together, and that decision making needs to be more localized. But it is that governance that's missing, and I think it's because it sounds not boring, but it's not as exciting as some of this other stuff we talk about. It does tend to get left when we're looking at big government policy decisions, and I think that's had a really significant impact on adaptation planning. I don't know if anyone else wants to pick that point up on the mitigation side.
David or anyone else?
I can talk briefly to it. I mean, the local authorities are key in bringing people together and helping to make decisions. We need localized decisions on how we decarbonise heating for buildings, and we've seen the success of the Climate Assembly last year in terms of getting people's voices into to advise how we go forward. That's particularly important at the local level, and it's going to be particularly important for how we heat our homes. So we would very much like to see BEIS and Ofgem and others devolving some of that decision making on those changes that we'll need in the next. The decisions are required in the next 5 years, and we need a programme now of how to engage with people and how to get their input on those decisions.
A question from George Martin, which I suppose is both mitigation and adaptation, but let's focus on the adaptation side. So Baroness Brown and Catherine Brown, when George asks, when will building regulations change from designing for compliance to designing for performance in use?
That has been something that we have been hammering on about for many years, and I think is it now 2 or 3 years ago, we produced a report jointly across both committees called Housing Fit for the Future, and one of the strongest messages was that we needed to be testing the performance and checking the performance of both new build homes, but actually also of refurbishments, to ensure that they delivered what they said they delivered. We pointed out that we had the Volkswagen scandal in cars, but actually the situation on thermal performance of homes is far more of a scandal. People buy homes that they are told are well insulated and will be cheap to heat. They have no real way of telling whether those homes are delivering that performance. And we know, in fact, that when that performance is measured, those homes are not delivering it. So they're spending far more in terms of their heating costs than they should be. But where is the Volkswagen scandal? It's not there. So we absolutely agree with the question.
I suppose the issue is with Volkswagen, there's someone to blame, and that's Volkswagen. Whereas if just in a general sense, builders are constructing homes, it's much harder to find someone who should be held responsible for that. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is somebody who
well, I think there is. This seems to me there are 9 builders that build something like 80% of our homes. Now, they know perfectly well that they are handing on to the people who buy their homes a bill. They don't tell them that, but they are, because they know they are building homes which are not fit for the future. And there's 500,000 since the government admitted that, and 1 million since the government changed the rules in 2017, which is the real reason for it. So there are 2 sets of people who are responsible. One is the Conservative government in 2017, and therefore its successor today. And the second are the builders who have not stood up to the real test. They are building houses which are not fit for purchase. And that means that they sell the house to somebody and they know that there is a bill with it which those people are going to have to pay in order to retrofit at 4 to 5 times as much as it would cost for the builder to build it in the first place. And I really do think that it is time that one made it absolutely clear the government is to fault because it's hasn't brought the rules up to date as it promised to in 2017, and we're still waiting for it. And the building industry is to fault because they know what they're doing and they could have changed it if they had been willing to do it, and the best of the builders have.
Thank you. David, a question from Jack Dobson-Smith. We've got 2 or 3 minutes here, and I'm going to make things worse by expanding the question. But Jack says the CCC states that renewables will need to meet 70% of UK electricity demand by 2035. Is now the time for the government to establish specific targets for solar and onshore wind development, as it has done for offshore wind? That's Jack's question, but I'm going to complicate it. What else is missing to completely decarbonize electricity? I mean, do we need, for example, to sort out the stability of the phase structure on the alternating current system? Do we need to change the way that domestic electricity is priced, or like what else needs to change to, because this seems to be the easiest thing, but we need to, obviously, if it's the easiest thing, we need to make the most progress.
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer the broader question, I mean, in terms of the changes that we need to electricity generation, we need continued deployment of renewable generation to push the fossil fuel generation to the margins where it's really just there in a backup role, in a peaking role, to only generate when absolutely necessary. We then need to decarbonize that backup generation. We can do that either with applying carbon capture and storage to gas plants, or by burning hydrogen rather than fossil gas in those backup plants. So there are a range of ways to do that, but those solutions, the hydrogen and the carbon capture and storage, don't exist at commercial scale in the UK at the moment. So the first priority has to be scaling those up and creating a market framework for their deployment, such that by 2035 we don't have the unabated gas generation on the system anymore. The other side of it is the bulk zero carbon generation from renewables. It could also be from nuclear, though the economics of nuclear are more challenging now because of the very fast cost reductions we've seen in renewable generation. Do we need specific targets for onshore wind and solar? I think certainly that would be valuable up to a point, but I think there is a question, exactly what should the mix be and who gets to decide that? Do we decide it centrally and have a target for every single technology, or do we have a framework that says contracts are available, but we're going to auction them and see which technologies actually can deliver what we need at the lowest cost? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that onshore wind and solar may well be the cheapest options there. So do they need a target, or do they simply need access to the markets for those contracts? The government has now committed to running an auction that includes onshore wind and solar for the first time in many years. So we will see after that auction how the economics look and how much pent-up supply there is. But that's going to be an important one. There are also questions about how much do we want to do onshore in terms of wind and how much offshore, and that's for planning reasons, for example, and public acceptance. There is a question, do we want to do more offshore, even if it's slightly more expensive as a country? But those are not economic questions.
Thank you, David. So before I put the final question to Lord Deben, I'd just like to thank all of you for asking concise, intelligent and pertinent questions. And I would like to thank our panel for supplying concise, intelligent and pertinent answers. I think it's made the last hour and a half a lot easier for me and a lot more pleasant for everybody else. So thank you. And Lord Deben, look, we're looking out to 2035, to 2050, to 2100, but what would you like to see the government do over the next few weeks and months?
Well, first of all, the net zero strategy. Secondly, that accompanied with the Treasury explanation of how it's going to achieve to achieve a just transition. I'd like to see the very immediate statement that the government is going to back and insist that Ofgem carries through the kind of system change on the electricity system, which is absolutely urgent and needs to be done, so that we know a bit more about sensible bringing offshore onshore, which we haven't got right anyway, and the system itself, so that it can balance and deal with the fact that we're going to have all sorts of vehicles now which could be part both of the generation and of the use of the electricity, of course, but also we'll need to be able to ensure that we can use our motor cars as a way of holding electricity at times when that's suitable. All those things can be done in the immediate future. And if I saw those, but above all, the net zero strategy in time for proper discussion and then for the COP26, if we had that and the net zero test, then I believe that we have a real chance of the global influence which a global Britain might want to have.
Thanks very much, Lord Deben, and my thanks to Tim Harford as well. So it's been a really great session, and I'm just going to wrap it up for us now. Thank you all for your questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all. There's so many of them. It's great. We're going to take a note of those questions, and it's very useful for us to see what you are interested in. Before we finish, I just want to highlight what's coming up from us at the CCC. So we've had the publication of the third climate change risk assessment last week, and we had the major piece of work we did on the sixth carbon budget last December. What that means is that we've reached the end of the major set of statutory reports that we supply every 5 years. So it's an exciting moment for us because it means we can shift our focus. So you've heard it a few times already. Today, we're going to shift our focus to real world progress, real world delivery, just as the government must. So you can expect more of a focus on those issues from us in our assessments and our analysis. We've got lots coming up from the autumn onwards. We're going to be responding, I hope, to the government's new net zero strategy when we see it. We'll be commentating on the COP26 preparations and progress once COP26 kicks off. And we'll be putting out a longer term programme of work and analysis for you to look at, which we hope you'll be able to engage with at the end of the summer. And on that list of issues is the kind of one I think is run through many of the questions today, that issue of public engagement, how we bring the public along with this transition, something that I'm personally very keen to look at and for the CCC to do some work on. So we'll be doing that too, more on that soon. Lastly, you can join us for a series of online events on UK climate risk, picking up some of the detailed analysis we did for the climate change risk assessment launched last week. We'll be doing a series of events from the autumn onwards, online again, and lots of opportunities for you to hear from us. So you can expect us, last thing from me, you can expect us to continue to hold the government to account on progress. And just as Lord Deben says, I will be delighted if we can start to say more positive things about what we're seeing from the government over the course of the next few weeks and months. But for now, my thanks very much to the panel. Thanks again to Tim, and thanks to you for joining us.